Was it from yesterday or the one Yeah, is it about the quiet direction of the Yes. That's not even easy to adjust. Thank you.
Hi, Claire. Can you hear me? Leave a comment if you guys can hear me. Leave a comment. Sorry, it took me a while to set this thing up. This is my first live event, so still trying to get used to it. Great. So we still have guests coming in, as you can see. It's going to be a large gathering of experts in the industry. So it's going to be a great day of sharing ideas. And having conversations around fin crime. 10 more minutes. The conference is going to start in about 10 minutes. So let me go get some coffee and yeah, get ready for the event because it starts in about 10 minutes. I'll be right back.
Okay, good morning everyone. Firstly, thank you all for attending. My name is Peter Doherty, I'm the current chair of the Institute for my studies, and my pleasure actually. It's been a wonderful year so far. I have the privilege of standing before you today based on the work of many others. Our committee has done a sterling job and will be doing a sterling job during the day. Two members in particular, Simran Barrage, who can't be here today, essentially took a holiday which immediately after spending some time arranging the conference, and Ruth Paley as well, who has done so much work to get this over the line over the last 2 weeks, probably giving up any personal time at all. Also standing on the shoulders of the previous chair of the Institute, who has gone on to do other things now, Tracy Dyers, and the man behind the Institute, who personifies pretty much everything we do, Mario Mendes. So thank you to all of those, and to our committee, and particularly to Ruth and to Simran, as I say, who's not here today. I'm now going to hand over to Ruth, who's going to introduce our keynote speaker, and we will then kick off.
Thank you so much. That's great, Pete, and thank you everybody for coming. It's wonderful to see you all. If you can't hear me, give me a shout, because obviously we've got sort of slightly wide layout, let me put it that way, so everybody's going to be looking this way and that. But if as the sort of day goes on, you want to move this way or kind of come into the centre, that's also fine. But look, without any further ado, let me welcome our keynote speaker. She needs no introduction, especially in the industry that we work in. Baroness Hodge, thank you so much for being with us today. Former MP and chairwoman of the Public Accounts Committee, has built up a reputation as a leading campaigner on corruption and illicit finance, as I'm sure you all know. Not afraid to ask difficult questions. She's known for shining a light on the impact of dirty money in the UK, and nowhere more so than in her current role as the Prime Minister's anti-corruption champion. She works with ministers and officials to enhance the UK's efforts in combating corruption domestically and internationally. We're incredibly lucky to have her here with us today. Thank you so much for coming, an absolute powerhouse of the anti-corruption community. Please join with me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Baroness Margaret Hodge.
That's a very, can you hear over at the other side? You're all right. If I'm like that, you can hear me. Yep, great. Okay, well, that's a very generous introduction. Clearly. Thanks very, very much, Ruth. I'm delighted to be with you, and I feel privileged to be the first person to address this day conference. And I have to say, I was thrilled, but a bit nervous when the Prime Minister appointed me as anti-corruption champion. I ended up in this role. It really is an accident of history, and I often tell the story about how I got there. So I became chair of the Public Accounts Committee, and thought it was going to be a bit tedious, really, because I thought it was looking at efficiency and effectiveness of public money, so it would all be auditors and people like that we would deal with. And the first person I met after I'd been elected was David Davis, the Conservative MP, with whom I've worked very, very closely. He came up to me and said, "Margaret, I'll help you do anything you need to do." He had done the job before me. And then he pokes me in the ribs and he said, "Vodafone. You've got to look at Vodafone's tax affairs." And I thought, what on earth has a parliamentary committee that is there to look at the efficiency and effectiveness of public spending got to do with looking at a private company and its tax affairs? But of course, what happens, it goes directly into the efficiency of HMRC, whether or not they collect the monies that are due from a big corporation like Vodafone. So that got me into it. And then I'll just tell you this other story, which really led us into it, is that we therefore had regular sessions with HMRC where we interrogated them. And I was sitting at home one Sunday evening with an absolute huge bunch of papers that the National Audit Office had prepared, which were excruciatingly boring. And I thought, how can I get some life into this session tomorrow? And I happened to pick up that week's copy of Private Eye. And they were running a story about a sweetheart deal that HMRC was alleged to have done with Goldman Sachs. So I thought, this looks a bit meatier. And the next morning we asked some questions about it to the head of tax. And he basically evaded them all by claiming confidentiality of taxpayers' interests. So we got nowhere. And at the end of it, I was rather frustrated. But my clerk passed me a bunch of papers in a brown envelope from a whistleblower.
Yeah, Sharon, I can see you.
In HMRC. And he said, you've got to read these. And I thought, God, I haven't got time. I was working really hard. But I did go through them. I found one piece of paper in there, which were the minutes of a meeting that had been held by the head of law in HMRC on the Goldman Sachs deal, in which he said the head of tax had shaken hands on the deal. And the head of tax had said it had nothing to do with it. So it was very naughty to lie to a parliamentary committee. And then it went on to call the deal unconscionable, which are quite strong words. So we called back the head of tax and we called back the head of law to see whether we could get them to confirm the minutes that had been passed to me. And they were evading the whole time. And then sitting next to me was my Conservative vice chair, who'd been on the committee for much longer. And he whispered to me, put him on oath. And I'd only just been chair for about 3 or 4 months. And I said, I can't do that. He said, yes, you can. So I turned to the clerk and said, can I put him on oath? We might get something more out of him. He said, yes, you can. So I said, go and find a Bible. And it took them about 20 minutes to find a Bible in the Houses of Parliament. We put the guy on oath. It made absolutely no difference to what he said. But it hit the 6 o'clock news. And that actually started a whole lot of stuff coming to us that led me into this whole territory. I just want to say one other thing, and then I'll get more specifically to what you're talking about today. When I started, it was about tax avoidance and tax evasion. It was about Google, Starbucks, Amazon. And I always think about a spectrum in this area. So we all, lots of people pay their cleaners by cash as sort of, it's a tax avoidance mechanism. And people may pay their builders by cash. That becomes a bit naughty. And then you go across the spectrum to aggressive tax avoidance, into evasion, and over into illicit finance, dirty money. And I think my journey has been through that spectrum, and I've ended up focusing very, very much on the illicit finance and fraud and money laundering over time. And it sort of shocked me. I think a lot of my parliamentarians, you work in the industry, so you're really important to us in seeking compliance and seeking out bad behaviour. But it shocked me, and it shocked the people I work with, to see the extent of that. And I think it's just worth talking about that a little bit. We've got to remind ourselves that they're all guesstimates, these figures, but people talk about £350 billion a year. That's a conservative figure that is lost to just the UK economy through fraud and money laundering. Put that 350 billion against what we spend on defence, and this year we put the defence budget up, and it's 62 billion. Put it against everything we spend on schools, and that's 64 billion. So it's a massive amount, 15% of Britain's GDP. Globally, according to the UN Office of Drugs and Crime, their guesstimate has got even wider parameters. The world loses through money laundering and fraud, through dirty money, somewhere between $742 billion to 1.94 trillion. And the worst about it as well is that the people living in the poorest countries suffer the most. So that this is not just a national problem, it really is an international problem that creates greater division and greater poverty among the poorest. In Britain, fraud is now the most common crime. And again, how many of us experience fraud and never report it? But it's 40% of all crime, and 1 in 11 crimes that are reported involve fraud. And the interesting thing here is UK businesses suffer from more fraud than businesses globally. So 64% of UK businesses are victims of crime, whereas globally the figure is 46%. So there is something of a UK issue about it. And we also have to never forget that fraud and money laundering, they're just not evil in themselves, but they're facilitators and enablers of all sorts of other crimes. So, think of people trafficking, the small boats, how much money has been fraudulently brought in and laundered that way, drug smuggling, or any other form of organised crime. Often it involves money laundering and fraud. And also think about the damage it does to our public services, because if it's illicit wealth, there's no tax paid from it, and therefore no contribution into the common pot for the common good. And think about even the housing market. If people are laundering their money in and buying enormously expensive properties, that does distort the housing market. So it's not just evil in itself, it has an evil impact throughout our society. And very importantly, it has an evil impact, in my view, on our reputation as a trusted jurisdiction, a strong economy, and therefore on growth. The UK prospered, the economy prospered really, because of our reputation for being a trusted jurisdiction. But we're beginning to lose that. The FinCEN now see the UK as one of the destinations of choice for dirty money. If you look at the Moody credit rating, we're on a downward trajectory there. And Transparency International's corruption perception interest has also moved us down from 11th of the countries they look to 20th. So we're losing that reputation. And my message always is to people who make money out of dirty money, and that involves lots of the enablers that you work with in your organizations, is that we will never actually exploit the effectiveness and strength of our financial services sector and obtain sustained growth on the back of dirty money. It's a short-term strategy, and I think if losing our reputation is much more important. There's plenty of good, decent money floating around the world, and we need to capture that to ensure sustained good economic growth. Now, since I started on this journey, which is now it's over 10 years ago, we've made some progress, and one of the joys for me, and I always say this, is that we've managed a really good cross-party work. This has not been a partisan issue, and some of my best friends now are people in the Conservative Party, where we've worked jointly to tackle the challenges. I talk about my partners in crime, and Andrew Mitchell's been somebody who I work very closely with. Tom Tugendhat has played a good role. Ken Clarke has been a real supporter of the work that we've all been doing. And in the House of Lords, there was Lord Theodore Agnew, who, if you remember, resigned from the dispatch box because he was so cross about the corruption. So I wrote him a little letter saying, can we meet for tea? And he took me to one of the 10 clubs that he belongs to in London somewhere, and we've been working very, very closely together. But that has led, I will tell you some funny stories, that has led, so when Andrew Mitchell and I were working to get legislation changed so that we would have registers of public registers of beneficial ownership in our overseas territories, our tax havens, because sunlight is the best disinfectant if we're trying to pursue dirty money. So we were working together as backbenchers. And we went through one by one of the Conservatives. It was a Conservative government. It was under Theresa May when she was Prime Minister. We went through one by one of the Conservatives, and I had a lovely room in the House of Commons, and I would invite them in for a cup of tea. And there were two that I remember. One was somebody that Andrew told me to talk to, and I looked at this guy's Wikipedia entry before he came in, and I thought, I've got nothing in common with this guy. He's anti-abortion, he's anti-gay marriage, he's a Brexiteer. There was absolutely no values in common. And then I saw he was anti-Russia. And within half an hour, he signed up to our amendment. And then there was another guy who came in. Andrew wanted me to talk to him. And I'd been working a lot at that time on anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. And he was a Jewish Conservative MP. And I said, I'm never going to get him. And the guy came in, we had a perfectly civil conversation for about 10 minutes. At the end of it, he said, Margaret, I completely understand your concerns and your desire for greater transparency. But I've got to say, I've got a lot of very rich friends, and they don't want their wives to know how much money they've got. And I did get his vote. So I think, talking about the progress that we have made down the years, Andrew and I did get that amendment through. There should be public registered beneficial ownership in both our overseas territories, and an agreement we reached with the Crown dependencies. And it's one of the tragedies and frustrations that we've got it on the legislation, on the books. It has yet to be implemented, and one of the tasks that I feel I've got to do. But we've made progress in other ways. We've had 2 economic crime bills, which hopefully will reform the Companies House and make it not just make it a proper tool that can be used with information to ensure that people aren't exploiting in a bad way our corporate structures. And the other thing is the Economic Crime Bill Act now has made it easier to share information with you guys, which is so important if we're trying to prevent and intervene early. And again, all the stuff there, we amended the government's bill a lot, and it was all moved by Conservative MPs, both and Conservative peers in the House of Lords. So it's a real good cross-party effect. We've introduced Magnitsky law with Bill Browder, some of you may know him. We've now got a register of overseas entity. It's not perfect, but it begins to tell us about who is using overseas tax havens really to instigate companies and then use their illicit wealth to buy properties in England. And we've got rid of the terrible golden visas that were introduced. This is why it is a cross-party thing. Those were introduced by Gordon Brown in the hope to attract wealth and investment in the UK. And over half of the people who came in under those golden visas were people from Russia and China. That's where a lot of the Russian kleptocrats came in. But there's lots left to do. And the importance of partnership, working with you guys in this space is really critical to our being successful in turning around this sickness that has infected Britain. So we need to work with you to share information. It's helping you to do your job, and it's helping us to get better at enforcement. We need to work with you to prevent crimes being committed, as well as detecting the wrongdoing when people behave badly. And we need to work with you to improve our regulation and enforcement policies and our capability. When I think about this, I sort of think about 4 principles through which I approach it. It's such a complex area, and there's so many ways in which there's so many issues that you've got to think about. So I think about transparency. I think the more openness we can get, the easier it is to follow the money. And once you can follow the money, the easier it is you can prevent crime from happening and detect crime. I think about regulation, and I don't want to have more regulation, but we need to have smart regulation that really works, and we're not there yet on that. I think about enforcement, and I'll come back to that, because I despair at Britain's weak performance really on enforcement, not sort of criticising any of the agencies, but the lack of investment that we put into enforcement. And I think about accountability. So as we bring in all these new things, we've got to make sure they work. Unexplained wealth orders have scarcely been used since they came in. It's very important that we should reflect and think about what works, what doesn't work, and take things forward. And I find using those 4 pillars a sort of good way to think about how can we better tackle the problem. And I'll just give you some examples of what I mean. They're on transparency. I've talked about the overseas territories and the Crown dependencies. We've simply just got to kill off that secrecy, those secrecy jurisdictions, because it's one of the things that makes Britain particularly attractive to those seeking to exploit dirty money. We had this step backwards to the European Court finding where they said that public registered beneficial ownership were an intervention with privacy rights. But I think the new regulations that Europe have now introduced and should be implemented by July next year should tackle that. In effect, we'll end up with public registers. So we need to get those in both the overseas territories and the Crown dependencies. And then I think we've got to think about other corporate structures. When Andrew and I were doing this, we did think about trusts. But if I'm absolutely totally honest with you, we thought that if we put trusts into the legislation as well, we'd lose a lot of Conservative support. So we left it out. And what has then happened is that a lot of people have stopped using companies and started using trust to hide their money. Particularly so when we came to sanction a lot of the Russian oligarchs. It was amazing how quickly Abramovich and Osmanov and other people like that switched their money into a trust. So I think we have to rethink that. Transparency is key. On regulation, I think that it's difficult to pull out the sort of main things though, but we have to look. All of you work in the sector. I am concerned about the way the professions are supervised and regulated at the moment. I think quite a lot of the organisations responsible for supervision are also lobbying government for change, and that mixture of being a lobbying organisation and a supervising authority is difficult. So I want us to look again at how we can better supervise all the enablers. And also there's so many organisations, and government is useless. I mean, HMRC is supposed to supervise the company service providers and don't do that. I don't think they do it at all. I don't think they've ever taken action against the company service provider. So I think we need to look at that, or better supervision. I would like to see something which probably will take some time to get in, but I think when I think about corruption and money laundering, these bad people, and there are lots of them, these bad people don't dream up the schemes themselves. They are invented for them by the enablers. And I think about how we brought in the Bribery Act, where we introduced then a duty to prevent on enablers bribery. And I think that had a very effective change. It wasn't we locked a whole load of people up. It actually meant it was a tool for changing, transforming cultures and behaviour. And that actually goes back further. The first example that Kevin Hollenrick, who's another conservator I worked with, always used was in the construction industry in the 70s. There used to be lots and lots of accidents on construction sites and people killed. And they introduced a duty to prevent there on the owners of construction companies, a duty to prevent accidents. Overnight, that went down by over 90%. So I'm disappointed that the duty to prevent fraud has got this SME carve out, because well over half of turnover is not covered by it. And I can't think that any decent company doesn't want to have put in place hopefully simple stuff to ensure that they can actually prevent fraud occurring in their business. And I remain disappointed that we haven't got a duty to prevent on money laundering. Although I know the AML regulations ought to cover it, they don't cover it well, they don't cover everybody. And maybe, we were having a discussion just before we started, maybe they too need a look at them again to make them more effective. So that's the sort of regulation I would like to see. And another one which I think affects you, SARS, the use of SARS. You know, I think for a lot of compliance officers, you fill in I'm sure nobody in this room does this, but you fill in a SAR and think you've done your bit, and then there's just thousands of these SARs that end up on the desk at the SFO, I think is where they go to. And I would love to see a sort of traffic light system introduced so that we really, we can focus, again, by working in partnership, focus our energy on those. So those are examples of regulation. On enforcement, I think we probably all agree that the UK needs to up its performance on enforcement. I'll just give you two figures. Standard Chartered Bank, British registered bank, when they were issued fines for MLA offences, in the UK we got 102 million. The Americans, who pre-Trump were much better at enforcement, got 842 million out of them. And if you think about the Danske Bank scandal, we got nothing. The Americans have got $2 billion out of action they've taken against the Danske Bank. So that, but what happens? We've already started taking action to improve that situation. One of the things, both the SFO and the NCO are absolutely petrified of losing cases. They've spent a lot of money on that. So the capping of costs in the litigation is just going through Parliament now. That should help. I would love to see a much greater use of recycling of fines, which is what happens in the States. Again, this is all pre-Trump, so we've got to wait and see whether it survives Trump. And the other thing is, I think actually, if you're working in government, lots of people work in government for very good reasons. But I think this came up to me out of the unexplained wealth order that we learned. We just didn't have the capability and the capacity to stand up to the private sector lawyers, if I'm absolutely honest, in that sense. So I'd love to see what the private sector actually, maybe even on a no-win, no-fee basis, come in and help government actually tackle some of the illicit wealth that we've got. And then I think we should also always update the economic crime levy. It's a good thing to have there, but we shouldn't see it as settled. You know, we need to perhaps raise that level as understanding how business are feeling and not feeling very happy about government at the moment. And on accountability, I think we need a process whereby all this stuff is held to public account through Parliament in some way, so that everybody can reflect on what is happening. Very finally, because I've gone on a bit too long, anti-corruption that I've talked about so far has been all about money laundering in the private sector. But actually, part of my job as the anti-corruption champion is also to tackle anti-corruption in the public sector and among politicians. And there's always been bad behaviour right the way through. I think back to Harold Wilson and his lavender list of peers. You then go to John Major and the cash for questions, and Tony Blair and the cash for honours, and Gordon Brown and the expensive scandals. So there's always been a little bit. What happened in the past was that where bad behaviour was uncovered, people lost their jobs and people got reprimanded, or people ended up being fined, imprisoned, etc., etc. I think, and I don't say this in a partisan way, but since Boris Johnson, things have got much, much worse. And standards have declined. You think about Owen Patterson and the way he accepted money and then lobbied for the organisations that paid him. You think about Baroness Michelle Mone. Some of you may have seen those really, really good television programmes online recently. You think about people like Peter Cruthers, who sort of bought his the peerage. You think about Russian money in politics. We reckoned, this was before I got this job and I was at the all-party group, that £3.5 million came from Russian kleptocrats into the Conservative Party. And just again to say, in a non-partisan angle, one of my colleagues took £500,000 from the Chinese. So it's, again, not a particularly partisan issue. So my anti-corruption strategy, and the work that the government's anti-corruption strategy, has to clean up politics and has to clean up the public sector. There are some manifesto commitments which I will hold ministers to the fire for. We said we would set up an independent ethics and integrity commission. We're committed to tackling party political funding, but we also have to look at a whole range of issues like lobbying, the jobs you take when you stop being a minister, public appointments, contracts, honours, and reform of the House of Lords, which I've just joined. But I think, again, nobody, you should have a much more open system. The Prime Minister shouldn't be able to have the final say in who goes into the House of Lords. It ought to be decided by a committee. And actually, all our CVs should be published to show whether or not we're appropriate in there. Right, all of this is up for discussion in the anti-corruption strategies. It's massive. 30 government departments I have to deal with. It's crazy way that government is organised. I know, it's complete body. But we're trying to do the best we can. I look forward, if we're going to get this working, to real strong conversations and working with all of you, because that's the way we will have better effect. And I look forward to seeing real progress in this Parliament, because I have this job in some key territories, so that we can really start turning around that terrible infection of dirty money that none of us want in British society. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So that's Margaret. Very interesting speech about corruption and how to stop illicit money within the UK. And is it encore? I see your question. I'll answer it later.
Okay.
while we're settling in, thank you again, everybody, for coming to the conference today. I think we are trying to have make it possible for everybody to really see everything that's going on. If you are sitting too far out, please feel free to move in a little more, because we have some seats left here in the back, and I think it's probably nicer if we're all a bit closer together rather than too far spread out. The first panel today will talk about what not to do when faced with regulatory scrutiny. And I'm really happy to have a couple of really good speakers here with me today. So everybody is really good for this. Everybody has really deep experience in the things that we are talking about. I want to let my panelists introduce themselves before we go into questions. Please, Simon, do you want to start?
Morning, everyone, and great to be here. My name's Simon. I'm a barrister at 3BB Chambers. I specialise in contentious FS, enforcement investigations. I've done investigations across a number of regulatory bodies, FCA, PRA, FRC, and there's also a whole host of overseas bodies, and I've worked on cases that have gone up to the tribunal, court of appeal, and thereafter. And so appreciated to be here.
Thanks, Simon. Thanks, Mario. Andy Keynes, I'm in DNB, a Norwegian bank here in London. Spent most of my career in the second line, or the dark side, as people like to call it. Recently moved to the first line of defence, apparently the darkest side. Done a stint in consulting and covered most financial areas.
Is this working? Yeah. Hi, I'm Hannah Laming. I head up the government investigations of my quality here at Spires. I've been in investigations for many, many years. Also been inside the SFO and the FCA's wholesale enforcement team, so I've worked there historically, and I've worked on many global investigations involving the SFO, the MCA, the FCA, the police, as well as all sorts of authorities overseas.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Sam Lehal. I was at Morgan Stanley for 10 years, working in a number of compliance jobs. Latterly, I was there head of financial crime outside the US. And then I went to Danske Bank, an organisation I've just clearly heard about as well, where I went to be the head of financial crime, and then became the chief compliance officer.
Simon, keep the microphone.
So I've done a few investigations.
Yes. Yes. So when we had the call to talk about this panel, we were really wondering what would people really want to hear about when it comes to this particular topic. So I think the first thing I want to do is I want to kick off with a couple of war stories. So maybe if all of you could talk a little bit about examples where you've seen missteps in early stages of investigations, where things escalated, where things have gone completely wrong, or where things have gone really well, and where you think this could really become again in the same way.
I'm sure we've all got interesting things to say, and a lot we'll agree on. I'll just give you kind of two things that I think I've seen repeatedly happen. One is organisations can be very slow to spot that they have a problem once the regulators start to tell them. You know, many of you will have that experience with, you don't wake up one day and the regulator says, you have a problem, this is your problem, right? You find during the course of an inspection or through the course of an exchange of letters that you are heading towards a problem. And I think sometimes I see that, and a lot of human psychology in my work can sometimes be slow to recognise that this is heading towards bad territory. I think that's one thing. So organisations just being very slow, and that really irritates regulators. And I think it compounds the magnitude of the penalty you're going to get, and more importantly, it's going to take you much longer time to rebuild trust. I think another thing that I see quite commonly happen, again, I think it's about sort of the psychology of people involved, is organisations when they start having this problem can start reacting in ways that they shouldn't, right? So there can be finger pointing. Whose fault was this? A lot of energy goes on. Who is this? Was it ops? Was it compliance? Was it legal? Was it first line? They can spend a lot of their energy on that. And quite often, I think senior people aren't stepping in to take full ownership of what needs to happen. So those are just some of the things I think we could perhaps touch on more, maybe through questions, and maybe you can reflect on whether that might happen in your organisation.
So I think just following up on that, one of the things things that I see quite regularly is a real difficulty within organisations to get their arms around the problem quick enough, which follows a little bit from what you're saying. Just to build on that bit, I think in those early interactions with the regulator, with the enforcement agency, it's really important to understand what they're looking at and why, and make sure that you have identified what data is likely to be relevant to that and who understands that data and where it is and how accessible it is and how your systems link up with each other so that you don't over-promise how you're going to respond and then under-deliver. And I think another part of that is where organisations are really concerned, for example, about financial impact, and in early communications with the agencies don't engage properly with potential harm to others, to consumers, to stakeholders, etc., which I think really rubs regulators up the wrong way. So those are some of the issues that I see early stages.
A couple of examples, I think. So one was where there was an overly legalistic approach and pushback to the regulator on findings. I think that's not what they're expecting. They're expecting you to be open. They expect you to think about UK PLC and about consumers. So don't go out with your defences all the way up. Secondly, it's a lack of appreciation of how much effort this is going to take in the long term. So it's mobilising, making sure people are aware across the organisation, whether you're a branch or you're in head office, making sure the right people know there's going to be a lot of work coming and how long that work might take.
So often, by the time I get involved, things are quite bad, so I think I see the very extreme end of things. And I would say there's sort of two things I see. So firstly, you see there's an organisation that's just culturally hostile to the fact that they're being investigated. And there may be a whole host of reasons behind it, but you can see it's animating the interaction and engagement with the FCA. And so you see the situation where actually the organisation's almost in battle mode, and at which point there's a real sort of intractable problem, and the FCA also responds to that. So you're faced with these two parties that are at loggerheads with each other. The other thing I see, the flip side of that actually, is an organisation which is almost falling over itself to be helpful. And I think actually that's not necessarily the right position for the business as a whole. And the difficulty with that is that then if you're being overly helpful, you can then inadvertently end up sort of providing information or inadvertently sort of expanding the scope of what you really need to do to respond to the queries before you. So it's a very careful balance actually, whereby you want to push back because that's in the best interest of the organisation, and actually on the facts that may in fact be a very justified position, but you also need to be seen to be engaging positively and cooperatively with the FCA. And there's a sort of a shorthand that I have, which is if you refuse on the one hand, always give them something with the other. And you don't necessarily have to give them anything particularly sort of huge or significant, even a crumb may do the trick, but it's a question of how you package it. And I think where this strategy feeds into is some of the comments that Satnam and Hannah and Andrew have been making, that actually what I see often is within an organisation, if the departments are not aligned internally, trying to understand what your strategy is going to be from the outset actually can be quite difficult. And I think some of the more extreme scenarios that I've seen, actually, when you start to sort of unpeel the onion, I think the root cause of them is that within the organisation, the various individuals that are dealing with it, they're not as between themselves aligned. And I think that then animates how they approach the whole exercise. And it can end up, as I say, either being far too hostile, at which point this is going to be a car crash, or actually it's too helpful, and you shouldn't be that much of a pushover because you're going to end up with other problems. But I think to your point about the human psychology, I actually do think even the things that I see, which are very legalistic, I think actually often when there is a car crash about to happen, there is something I think in the backwater about how it's being managed internally.
I might just a few other things again, so these might be obvious, but one thing I think a lot of organisations will have sort of regulations function. I think particularly when you're heading towards a problem in the middle, it is so crucial to have within the organisation a central person who's coordinating all of the dialogue with the regulation, no matter how trivial it is, even if they're just sitting in on meetings. I think that becomes really, really important because the regulator I think generally prefers it, but they're giving you often subtle cues, etc., which go missed in different people. And whoever goes into that meeting with the regulator of the organisation, they always have subtly different selfish agendas. So it's really important to have someone neutral going in and doing all those meetings. I think on that point, I have sometimes seen organisations sort of get very tactical with the regulators, and they sort of use the lawyers to say, you know, and they're not necessarily being kind of misleading, but they think that's how to get out of this. Let's be very strategic. I think in different jurisdictions, I would recommend slightly different approaches, but I think in the UK, as a compliance officer, I've always said, be very open. A rule of thumb for me is if someone comes to me at a relatively senior level and says, should we disclose it? I think by the time it's come to me and it's probably in the grey area, the answer is yes. So if you think you need to bring it to me to ask the question, I'm ready to disclose it. I think one thing you need to do is not bombard the regulator with useless information, right? Because that also means that you're just giving them more work. You need to not sound stupid. You need to say to them why you think this is relevant. I have generally found that being over-disclosive with the regulator really helps you in that longer-term mission. Your aim isn't just to fix the problem you've got. I think quite often organisations, I've got a KYC problem, the goal is just to fix it. What your bigger problem is, your regulator thinks you're crap at what you do. And once you fix this KYC problem, they don't disappear. They're going to be looking at you for the next few years, right? So your bigger mission is to rebuild their trust.
And I come to you on that. I want to pick up on what Satnam has said, because I'm really interested in where we draw the line between being open and cooperative with a regulator and where self-incrimination stops, especially in the regulated sector where we've got, Principle 11 requirements. We have a requirement to be open and honest with the regulator. At what point are we in danger of self-incrimination, and how should we not be cooperating with regulators?
So I think I'll start by saying I do agree with you. I think generally being as open as you can be and as cooperative as you can be tends to be more likely to head off problems than going the other way. It does, of course, depend on the nature of the problem and your overall strategy. But I think the critical thing is to really understand the nature of the issue that the regulator is looking at. And if you think the scope is too broad, seek to narrow that scope by agreement. And if you think that they are looking at something in particular, make sure that the information and the disclosure that you have focuses in on that and doesn't go broader than that. And I think where you want to be trying to help them is to understand from your organisation's perspective what you think is relevant to the issue that they've got a concern with, and then limiting the disclosure in that way. Because if you put yourself in the shoes of the regulator, and I've sat in those shoes, so I can speak to it a bit, and the SDA is sometimes a bit different, but it's still our issues here. They don't understand your business how you understand your business, and so being able to explain to them why a scope is too broad and how it's going to result in them ending up with a lot of unhelpful information that won't be relevant to the issue that they're looking at, versus directing their focus onto the key, whether it's information, documents, systems, or whatever it is that are most relevant, enables you to then be open and cooperative and actually help them, but also not end up giving them tons and tons of information material that isn't relevant and may make the situation worse or broaden the scope ultimately.
Simon, to go back to it, because I think you've touched on it briefly as well. And you want to come here?
Thanks, no, I think some very good points there. I think Sam's point earlier around when do we escalate to the regulator, and if it's already got to me, then it's probably a yes. And I think the answer to where do we draw the line? And it might sound obvious, but it's preparation, which is day in, day out. So you have that demonstrable compliance that any issues go through committees, you have minutes, you can demonstrate it's being considered. So you have a robust position when the regulator comes to ask something. If the regulator comes in, it shouldn't be a surprise. If it is a surprise, that's when you start thinking, oh my God, what did we miss? Why has this gone wrong? But I think if you've got the minutes, you've got your policies and procedures that are up to date, you have your risk assessments up to date, you have your MRO report up to date. If you've got everything covered off, you can see that FCA enforcement activity, DSCO letters, speeches being considered in the right governance fora, then that whole concept of when do we have to communicate has been discussed a number of times. So that preparation starts day in, day out, not when you get that knock at the door or the letter address. I know it sounds obvious, that's the easiest answer I have. It's just to make sure the culture is there day in, day out.
Just to add on, in favour of the over-disclosure, I think your professionals, you kind of know, right? So if your problem is you're not refresh your high-risk customers KYC for the last 2 years, you've got a problem. But if you've been looking at that, you know one of the reasons is that you've not been, your risk rating tools have been working well, you can't get the data. Those are adjacent issues that you need to disclose. And I think, you know, for those of you in that situation, often the problem is not getting a section 166, it's the never-ending section 166, right? And, you know, if there's problems that come out now in the lovely settlement you have, the letter you have, in the next 2 years they're going to come out, right? So I really am in favour of the greater disclosure. Use your judgment, if it's a completely unrelated insider, but clearly, but if it talks to other bits of the problem, you have to disclose it. It will come out.
Simon.
I'll just add a few comments, I suppose, from the litigator's perspective. So the way I see these things is different clients have different risk appetites. So my job as a lawyer is obviously to advise them on what is the regulatory framework, and within that, what are the legal obligations. The way I sort of look at disclosure is it's often an ongoing issue, actually. So it may be on day one you look at it and think, well, actually, from a reg or a legal perspective, there's probably grounds for not disclosing, but it may change by day 10 or day 20, so you're constantly looking at it. And there is also, I think, a commercial risk appetite, and I've had clients whose appetites are very, very widely. I think a lot of it also, I think, depends on, I suppose, the strategic vision that you have in place for the enforcement investigation, and also parallel to that, well, actually, what's the business plan? So I have some organisations that say, well, actually, X department in the next 12 months wants to roll out a new product. And you look at that and say, well, actually, if that's what you're planning to do, you can't afford to have this regulatory issue hanging over your head. So it's probably in your best interest to just disclose it up front and try and sort it out. Because if you don't sort it out now and it erupts whilst you're in the midst of rolling out a new product, it's probably going to kill that sort of business stream. So it's very, very nuanced, actually. And it's something you have to deal with on a case-by-case basis. But yeah, I find that the grey area is a very difficult area, hence why it's in the grey zone. But I do think a lot of it comes down to what is the client's long-term vision for what they're doing as a business, and allied to that, what is their risk appetite?
I think the risk appetite is a really key element there. I know we're supposed to be, making this as practical as possible. So the MROs out there, I mean, I've used that personally, that where something's not working properly, I can use that as leverage. I cover the base points to know that I won't get fined or I won't go to prison personally when the FCA come in and find it. However, it's not brilliant. That means when it does get discovered, I then have the power to turn around and say, well, I've got the baseline covered, we're all right, something's going to happen. And therefore turn around to the manager and say, well, this is what I've been telling you for a number of years, please invest. We have the solution, we've been telling you what it is. You know, you play the politics of how you say that to them. But as long as you come with the baseline, you know something might happen, but then you get the leverage to actually improve the organisation, and that's sort of a personal risk appetite that I took. You don't have to gold plate everything. You can actually use some of these issues to get things changed down the street quite easily.
I would love to make it a little bit more practical, if you don't mind. So what I'm interested in is regulatory contact. If you have contact from a regulator, when you have contact from a regulator, what are the things that you should really be doing in the first 24 hours, and what are the things that you really should not be doing in the first 24 hours?
Okay. First thing, yeah, don't panic. I know it's obvious, but again, it comes down to the preparation. Do you have a procedure to respond and to pick up and just go, right, regulators coming in, or we've been served with an order, this is what we do, this is how we respond. This is the RASI matrix, this is the cascade, this is who needs to know what information at this point in time, this is how we mobilise the resources we need within the organisation, potentially outside of the organisation, to support through this event. So it's don't panic, it's make sure you're prepared well in advance, so you know what to do. There's no running around, it's like, well, who owns this, you should be doing that, and is John still here? It's, okay, here's the manual, we walk through the procedure, like we've done in our tabletop exercises, like it's been tested by first line, by second line, by third line, and potentially by external parties to make sure it works. That's the whole point, that's why the regulator wants you to test your controls on a regular basis to make sure they're working. To make sure they're working. So don't panic. Have a plan already there, ready to go.
Hannah, do you want to add to that as well?
Yeah, so I think for me, the first thing is make sure you've got the right people in the room. So when you see what the nature of the issue is, and I think probably for both Simon and I, when we're involved, the issue's quite significant often, so it's quite a big problem. And that can mean that there is a huge amount of information and different elements and strands to it with competing interests and priorities. And so I think for me, the first thing is to try and clear a path through the wood with the main people who are going to be involved in the response to the regulator and understand what it is, as I say, and I've said it so many times, but it's so important. What is it that they're looking at? What's the scope? What are they asking you for right now? What is it that they want in the next 24 hours, 2 days, 3 days, 5 days? Who is able to deliver that and how are they going to do it? And if there are elements of it that are easier to deliver, can we get that information together first so that we can start a rolling process so that and it comes back to your point that you're giving something all the time so that the regulator can see that you're engaged and see that you're making progress. And if you're identifying issues with related information or data, ensure that you're keeping them updated and that you're obtaining timelines for when you can provide that information or data and how you're going to do that. And I think coming back to your point about having someone in the room, it's absolutely imperative that you keep track of what you're saying to the regulator, and if you've got more than one, what you are saying to the regulators, plural, and making sure that it's consistent, and it's consistent with your internal communications and messaging, and that everybody knows what has been delivered and where you're going. Because the worst thing really is that there's a terrible panic at the beginning. Lots of information and documents are shared in an uncontrolled manner, and 7 to 14 days in, no one really knows exactly what's happening. So those would be my sort of, they're very practical, so I hope they're not too obvious, but those would be my sort of top tips.
No, I think it's important. Sometimes the obvious things are really obvious. Satnam, would you mind? I think maybe I would really be interested in what's on your regulatory playbook. I think we talked about that as well.
Yeah, I would agree with all the things you guys said from my experience, so just a few things I would add. I think sometimes organisations in that situation, for everything to be done quickly, buy some time. And you definitely can buy some time. If you've not been doing high-risk KYC for the last 2 years, an extra month is probably not going to be able to work, right? Definitely buy time. And the reason why I say that is I've seen situations where organisations, it's just the nature of our people is, we want to have a plan, we're going to fix this. I bet you that letter you get from the regulator, somebody else is passionate, full of ambiguity. And I think one thing that organisations do is in the early stages is they sort of read the letter and I know what they want, and then they send a letter back saying, we commit to doing this. Let me give you a customer. We will refresh the KYC on all our house customers. By 20, straightforward response, very simple. But what's your definition of house customers? What's if your definition changes between now and then? Are you committed to do them as well? There's a lot you kind of need to think through, and I think being really, really precise about what it is that the regulators are asking and what you in turn are going to be connected to. No organisation ever has house customers up to date every single day. Always about those things really matter. They will matter when you come to the process. I think buying time and avoiding making slightly knee-jerk responses and simplistic responses is going to be quite important. I think it's also, one other thing I would add is sort of like, what's your role and your team's role in the situation? I think it's a place where compliance officers can really come into their own and really flourish. Your job is to, I think, bring calm when they're not panicking. There are a small number of organisations who need an injection of panic, and therefore that might be your job, right? People sort of sitting around not quite seeing what's the enormity of what's just happening. Again, how are you going to approach it? What skills are you going to need? Be also conscious of your own kind of morale and how you feel about it. Maybe you feel a bit defensive of what's happening. So I think, what role are you going to play as a leader? Really opportunity to step up. The other thing I would say is, think about the partnerships that you need. If you're going to be central to resolving this, a critical relationship in these situations is always the compliance integration one, because they often the two things that work best in these situations, internal litigation. But who are your partnerships in ops and technology? Kind of be thinking about this, and then finally I would say about your team as well. This can be really draining work for people who work with junior people who work with, and not just for people who work with ops, they're probably in Warsaw or Thailand, somewhere else doing that. These are critical people to your success, right? And I think sometimes compliance officers sort of see their really important sort of leadership role in kind of keeping morale up amongst those more junior staff who are going to be delivering on these programs.
Yes, one more thing on that team. I think it's key. It's knowing your own and your team's limitations as well. So, you know, a good project manager from the off makes the world of difference. That's all I'm going to say. I'm not a good project manager. You engage people, you bring the skill sets in which you just one more thing as well. I think we talk about an off-ramp in sanctions. We have to do that as well when we have this regulatory scrutiny. What's the end goal? Is it? It's what everyone said. We don't rush into this. We don't just promise things. It's where do we want to get to? What does the regulator want to see? It's smooth running KYC on high risk clients. So we're not going to promise we're going to do this by then with everything and all bells and whistles. Again, a live example, war story. If you promise to do full remediation to the whole client base and you don't scope out the dead clients, yes, some regulators hold you to account for that. So to scope it out, what is the off-ramp? What's that end state which you want to get to? And that's where you go from day one. That's what the targeting is.
You know what, I'm really sad.
So just 30 seconds, but just to say, I would also take the view, obviously you need to be calm, take stock of things, but don't feel like you have to capitulate with everything the regulator says. And I appreciate they've got huge rating pounds in FISMA, but fundamentally it's a two-way relationship. And obviously it's a judgment call because you need to look at the nature of the problem that they're probing, and it may be that you do know that beneath the service are 10 layers upon, so you've got to be careful how you manage it. But I would say don't be shy or fearful, and it's a question of how you present that firmness. And I think often actually delay is useful for an organisation. I don't think there's anything wrong with that actually. It's part of the strategic vision you have for the reg investigation, and I wouldn't be shy putting that forward. I mean, but to Andrew's point, I think that project manager point is actually an excellent one. And when I think of one case where I can't mention it because happily it resolved itself, but the FCA did a thematic review of a particular sector of the industry, and we were the only people that weren't subject to a section 166 actually. And I think the only reason they did it is because within that organisation they had the most phenomenal project manager who underneath him had a team who were excellent. I mean, I saw them crack the whip, not sure I would have wanted to be in that team, it was pretty robust. But to your point, actually, I think what's made that case and what helped it to get it off the FCA's radar was actually the human management side of it. And that, strangely, was much more important than the technical legal reg arguments that the lawyers were coming up with.
I would say, you know, the challenge of most compliance departments, you don't have the resources or the skills. You're not set up to deal with these kind of emergencies. You will never be given the headcount. You're doing business as usual and that reason. So it's almost certain that you aren't going to have either the quantity or the skills. So be very thoughtful about that and go and get it. I see it's working consultants and shout out to them. You know, this is probably a time when it is really helpful to get a consultant in the early stage of the scoping because they will have seen 30 of these and you probably are dealing with one or two and you've got some friends. But I think at that scoping stage it's really, really helpful to get external input and to bounce off ideas of how to respond, what's reasonable, what should this look like compared to how it currently looks. I think getting those people involved is helpful.
I just have one thing to Simon's point as well, which is there's been a number of occasions where we've been involved in investigations after they've started, and the relationship with the regulator isn't great. And one of the things that we've often done to try and engage and turn that around is to effectively present, and it can be formal or less formal, but present to the regulator, this is where we are, this is what we have done. These are the data sets that are relevant to what we're looking at. This is the size of them. This is how difficult it is to interrogate them for the following reasons. This is what we're doing about that. These are the timescales that we're working towards at the moment on the basis of our current knowledge. This is when we think we're going to deliver these particular deliverables. And agreeing those things and then regularly updating can make a huge difference. And that all comes back to that project management part, which is about how you're communicating with the regulator and the steps that you are taking and show you're taking, even if you can't deliver exactly what they're asking for right now.
Thank you, I think that's useful. I am a bit sad that in 2025 we are talking about KYC remediations. Right? I think a couple of years ago I went to a conference and somebody was talking about the change in regulatory focus away from KYC and due diligence more towards transaction monitoring and payment screening. So it's not just about what do you do to bring your client through the door? Do you actually monitor them? Do you actually, keep an eye on what they are doing once they are in? I'm interested to know if you would be able to talk a little bit about what signals you may have seen about future regulatory focus and what firms should really prepare for. I think KYC and transaction monitoring aside, what else is there that we really need to think about?
A couple of quick things. I think the UK regulators and I think European regulators generally, there are also firms out there who fail on the basics. If you're one of those firms, it doesn't matter what the trend is, you're not making a sanction screening to a robust and risk-appropriate standard is that is going to be that's where I think it's going to be underlying regulators are very, I think they should be really good at if you are a firm who's not making a risk transaction market sanctions screening. I think in terms of trends, I think at least in the UK, perhaps also in other places, I think there is a focus on the feeling that the very large established US and UK firms on financial crime, they probably is what they're focusing a lot on other parts of financial services, payments providers, etc. Particularly if they've got more market share, you're no longer viewed as the lovely fintech that's going to challenge these really anti-competitive large organisations. If you've got 10% market share in the FX pair, I think you're relatively regulated focus on. And then if you are a foreign bank, new bank, with a subsidiary or branch in the UK,
I think you're spot on with that, yes.
So I deal both with USA but also with a variety of regulators in the UK, and I think one of the things that's going to be quite interesting in the next couple of years is seeing how the new legislation in ECTA that's been spoken about earlier in terms of both the changes to liability for economic crime and also the bench fraud offence are investigated, prosecuted by regulators and enforcement agencies. We have a lot of inquiries from clients, and I feel as though organisations are still really grappling with this legislation and trying to understand it fully and what it means for organisations, where the real risk lies, and how to actually implement pragmatic, proportionate controls around it. So I think that if the agencies do proactively pursue that, that's going to be quite a significant area of focus, I think, for organisations. Sanctions is and continues to be, and I know you probably talked to that one as well. And I think the other thing that we're seeing is an increase in whistleblowing. I think that will continue when you look at the direction of travel of legislation in Europe and in the UK as well. But whistleblowing that brings together a number of different issues. So people are complaining about different types of bullying and harassment and potentially unlawful conduct. And if you're in the regulatory sphere, maybe regulatory conduct. And organisations are then facing the challenge of how do you investigate all those different things in line with the policies, which might be different in relation to different areas of them, and there might be personal grievances involved. And a lot of the work that we're doing is cross-team, cross-jurisdiction, featuring multiple elements of different practice areas, and bringing all of that together to ensure that you've undertaken a robust investigation that will withstand scrutiny and deals with all the issues, I think poses an ongoing challenge. And if we do see an office of whistleblower come in, if we do see increasing incentivisation for whistleblowers, I think that we're going to see a lot more challenges in this area.
Thanks. There's probably a couple of areas I must say. In terms of markets and the regulated markets and equities and things like that, having seen some of the enforcement activities talking about some of the investigations that have gone on, and when you look behind the scene, it's quite easy to organise funds through implicit markets, firms and brokers very easily. So I think that would be an area of focus increasingly in the future. And then there is a thread there in the next area, it's sort of three combined areas. So we know the FCA has been talking about the consumer duty, the expectation there, and conduct is an ongoing area, but data as well. You know, they want to become a data-driven regulator. They want to deep dive data. They want to see where the erroneous points are and the extremities are. and consumer duty into conduct and how you measure that. Data and liability. And I think that will be an increasing area of focus. That if a firm doesn't start managing its data and can't produce simple information, that speaks to larger issues. Like we were saying earlier around KYC remediation with the high-risk clients. It's the and. And if you don't have the data, like even with the climate risk rating methodology, if you don't have the data to produce one, then that speaks to something else. If you don't have the data to understand what your trade sanctions exposure might be to potentially your client base, then it's not coordinated, it's not holistic.
I'll just be very brief, so there's time for questions as well. So the reality is, with the FCA's objectives, they're also partially policy driven. So as we know, the Treasury's banging on about the growth agenda. What that actually means, who knows? But literally, I suspect behind doors, there's lots of conversations about what the FCA can or should be doing to promote that. But parking that to one side, I suppose there's two key areas. As Hannah mentioned, sanctions. I think we're seeing the tip of the iceberg. We'll see more and more of it. And the banking industry is the front line of, as it were, trying to sort of enforce or prevent sanction breaches. And you've also got the separate issue about circumvention. But the key, I think, the key element of that are when you're processing payments or transfers and fund flows. So I think sanctions perspective will be key. And then separately, I think any entity that's involved in the payments process, because the reality is in terms of the fight against financial crime, global financial crime, the payments processes are actually a fundamental part of that, because these days you can move huge amounts of money from one side of the globe to the other in the blink of an eye. So I think in that sector there has been and there will continue to be, I think, huge scrutiny, and actually not just from the FCA, I think more broadly across the piece.
I think that's very true as well. We have a little bit of time. I think we're going to run a little bit longer with the session. Do we have any questions from the audience? Anything from anyone? Yes, please, the gentleman over there.
Thanks, Ed. Go easy.
Thanks, Andy. It's a quick one. So thanks for your time anyway, and the first 24 hours obviously very key. As you go further into sort of that regulatory sort of scrutiny, 166, or even sort of internal audits, as many of us have seen, is the scope creep. How do you go back and push back to a regulator about sort of that scope creep? Obviously, you've got an enforcement notice, so you've got your notice to come through from 166. How do you keep them in line with that? And that's from a skilled person perspective and the FCA perspective.
Hannah, do you want to? Was the question for anyone in particular, or was it for the panel in general?
So scope creep from the regulator themselves as opposed to the skilled person? Both. I think handling the skilled person is probably easy, because I wouldn't expect the FCA to go wildly askew. It's sticking to the facts, sticking to the requirement notice, pushing back. You can be more harsh with a skilled person than you can with the regulator. There's some very blunt conversations with skilled persons in the past, and it's usually worked when it's trying to get the clarity of why are you going down this route. You know, drains up. I think the reference earlier to having external consultants supporting that conversation as well. The ones that also act as skilled persons, that they can turn around with the arguments to actually trim that down and stop that scope from happening, because it can be an absolute nightmare.
I think it talks to my point earlier about making sure you're quite precise earlier on when you're reading the so the more detail you get, the easier it is to avoid having a conversation about whether this is in scope or out of scope, right? And whether that's a skilled person enforcing that with the FCA. So another thing I would just say, which I kind of know, is, look, is it reasonable? Is it actually true? Because sometimes you start doing a remediation and you realise we didn't know X was the case. That will come up, right? Which I'm sorry, reason why something's got to be working on the standard process. So there will be things to watch. I think I would say use your judgment. If it was like a legitimate addition, then I think we need to agree with them, not be love you so much.
I mean, just to come up with the FCA, it's the question of how you push it, because sometimes if you've got a legitimate point and you push it too much, they then just go away and say, well, we're going to issue a fresh MOA. So I think it's also a question of saying, well, actually, And I guess it just goes back to your point about reasonableness. You also look and think, actually, is this a sort of issue which I'd rather sort of, I can almost get brownie points and say to them, look, it's not under your MOA, but because of being, cooperative and what have you, we'll deal with this. So you might take that judgment call and say, actually, we can deal with it in a fairly rough and ready informal way. Whereas if there's a fresh MOA issue, then actually that might involve a much more sort of forensic deep dive, which we don't want. So there's a judgment call to be had. We'll always do it professionally, I'm sure.
We had a question here in the front.
In terms of preparedness and regulatory playbook and manual of any regulatory interaction, have you ever seen or been part of a mock test where internally you pretend with a regulator, for instance, on an area of concern you have to see whether or not you might have a more effective response from the business?
Not quite the kind of like the way you say boards do it, say let's mock up the participant had. But I have done it, the way I've found it is to use audit to have a good relationship with your audit team and ask them to run what you could have a section that audit as a way of running it. For me, again, it depends on the size of the organization. I don't think you need a manual of what happens on the day you get the letter. You should think through how you will be able to do it. I think what's more fruitful is to sort of say, if you went off to work at a regulator, you happen to be allowed to kind of supervise the field, and you hated something, and you wanted to find some problems, right? And have that mentality. If you were actually the regulator, you're coming in with that kind of slightly touchy attitude, what was it? And I would say spend a bit more energy on that. So spend a bit more energy on making sure that you know what your issues are. If they came tomorrow, how would you talk about those issues? Again, if you're a regulator, the worst thing organizations where you feel like we're all on a family issue and no one there. That's not necessary. But thinking that through, I think as a regulatory really short thing. Look, I know about this, obviously says insurance, we've not yet had it. That is in general.
Hi, so when it comes to documenting issues, a lot of organizations historically have said anything documented is discoverable. But in my view, if you don't document it, you can be accused of being negligent. So it's better to document and then give a rationale as to why you might not be dealing with it right now because of your list of priorities. What's your view?
I 100% agree with you, and I bet that's the way to do it. And it's a good
With all these things, I've talked about all the investigations, as you know, it starts off with investigations that before you know it, the compliance officer is also being an individual investigator, or the CFO or the CEO. So you've got to also bear that in mind if you are holding one of those functions. And I suppose if you're the compliance officer, for example, or the MLRO, you should be documenting what you're doing because actually it may end up being the thing that gets you out of an individual investigation. I think it's just a question of, and it is a judgment call, what is the extent of the documentation? But I think actually often you need to have some level of an audit trail. And that, so I think it's a question of how you frame it. Frame the process.
I would love to do some more, I just don't know how much time we have. So I have one more question from the gentleman over there. And then I think for everybody else who wants to have a chat, feel free to approach the speakers over coffee. We will be having a coffee break later.
Yes, more brief as possible. Thank you. Sid from Julius Baer. My question is, are there any potential indicators or signs we can gauge through the nature of the regulatory visit? And I ask this because we had a visit last year. We got sent an agenda. We sent them the information. They came in and they said they wanted to talk about 5 topics. But by the time they came in, they completely spoke about something else, like whistleblowing, conflicts of interest. And at that point, it sort of tuned into the question that the gentleman asked. We said, yeah, your agenda was completely different to what you had sent and get prepared about that we had sent. We legitimately did a mock interview and everything. And the questions were almost 70 to 80% different. At which point we did push back, and it just seemed completely confusing. And the whole feeling we got from this was Was this an exploratory visit? Was it something that they were tipped off about, and we came back nonetheless wiser in our situation? So, yeah, we'd be grateful to know your thoughts on that.
I'd love to respond very briefly on this because you are not the first person who said this. So I've met a friend a couple of days ago. He was having a visit from the FCA a couple of days before. The FCA did not even send an agenda. Right? It was, coming on day X, have a room ready and have coffee ready, basically, and nothing else. And it was really just very, fluid conversations without any real topics. So I don't think you are the first person to say this, and you will definitely not be the last person to say this. We've discussed it internally at the Institute as well, and I've discussed it with friends. I don't want to say something wrong, but I think there may be a little bit of confusion on the side of the FCA. We feel, or I personally feel, that the drive for growth that the government wants may not necessarily sit very well with the FCA, and that the FCA will not really know how to approach the drive for growth on the one hand with a drive for regulation on the other hand. So I think we'll probably have to wait. And the other thing that I think is always important to remember is it always depends who you're dealing with. On the side of the FCA, I have seen significant differences there as well. You may be dealing with somebody at the FCA that is very calm, very collected, very quiet, and then the next week you may be dealing with somebody who is quite emotional. So it really depends who you're getting.
I was just going to add to that there. If you have that situation, it's like any other business meeting. So effectively what you're saying to me is, I'd really like to answer these questions. You're asking me a set of questions that I haven't had an opportunity to go and look at before you've arrived. To make the meeting as effective as possible, that would have been preferable. I will try and do the progress that I can today. I may not have the right people in the room, I may not have the right information to hand. And keep a note of that meeting so that you can show that the approach that you're taking is reasonable. And don't get lambasted into starting to try and opine about things that aren't in your area of expertise or knowledge or other people's in the room. Just be polite and firm and say, we want to help, we want to be open. And unfortunately, your agenda is quite different to the point you're raising now. It will take me a bit of time to go away and look at that and come back to you.
I think we need to move to the next one. I'm very sorry that we can't take any more questions, but I think we're going to have a coffee break just after 12, so please feel free to approach the panel without any more of the I'm really sorry, but we have to put up with it again for the second panel as well.
Oh, sorry.
Already in the last panel that sanctions and ABC issues are of interest to regulators as well. The second panel that we're having will talk about ABC enforcement and recent geopolitical changes, especially in the US, with noise around the FCPA. And we want to talk about proactive ABC, the proactive enforcement agenda for ABC here in the UK. I want to give my panelists a couple of minutes to do their introductions, and then we are going into questions. Emma, would you introduce yourself, please?
Thank you. This is working. Hi everyone, I'm really pleased to be here. My name is Emma Uxton. I'm the interim Director of Operations at the Serious Fraud Office. So look forward to an interesting session.
Hi, Hi everyone, I'm Anna Bradshaw. I'm a partner at Peters and Peters in London, specialising in sanctions.
I'm Ryan from Courtesy, and I'm
that was really quick introductions. I wanted to go straight into questions. With the last panel, we've asked everybody to talk about war stories. I'm not going to go about how you would each describe the things that you see enforcement globally and also in your area of focus. Are we losing momentum, or are we simply shifting approach?
Thanks. Well, at the Serious Fraud Office, we're as committed as we have ever been in enforcing the UK Act. We're taking steps to ensure that we stay on track with that ambition. It's always been a part of our mission for several years now that we investigate and prosecute fraud and bribery to help ensure that we get mercy as a safe place to do business. That's not a new thing, that's something that we've always strived to do. It's been part of our goals. We've obviously set a new 5-year strategy under our recently acquired new director. And we are an investigator and prosecutor of all of the basis fully equipped to enforce UK Bribery Act. We've recently issued our new guidelines, some of you may have seen. Again, this isn't a new thing. We have, since the introduction of the UK Bribery Act, we have had some guidelines for corporates to help them understand the framework with which to engage with a prosecutor as us. On issues that they may have concerns about and to self-report about. And obviously we've had the deferred prosecution regime that has seen 12 deferred prosecutions secured by the Serious Fraud Office and run by the CPS. And that has been a really successful resolution for us in those cases. And we continue to investigate and prosecute those cases. We're also refining our referrals process. So you heard mention of SARS earlier on. We're beefing up our intelligence capabilities, and that includes scanning SARS more effectively for information. It also involves more proactive use of our intelligence capabilities. We're also strengthening our international partnerships. All of our cases involve international dimensions, be it banking, structures, etc. And that means, obviously, with the US DOJ, a very important partner for us, and we have close links and close working on a number of our cases that are ongoing and a very positive partnership despite the recent changes we've seen in FCPA enforcement. Some of you may have seen the recent change in the last couple of weeks where we're almost back to the position we were before February and as we were before. We also launched our International Anti-Corruption Prosecutorial Task Force in March with the Swiss Office of Attorney General and the French BNF. Very close working partners for us in any event, but it really strengthens that working relationship, and we're able to share practice on a much more regular basis and work together on the cases. We currently have a joint investigation with the French BNF already, which was announced last year in Thales, and we have a number of joint investigations with European partners on our books. We've also had some really excellent news recently coming out of the government spending review, which is unusual for us to hear good news about funding. We're delighted, and it means that by the end of this 4-year budget period, we'll be looking at a 22% increase in our yearly funding, so just shy of 100 million, which is fantastic. And we've got some really exciting plans about how we're going to spend that, including expanding our workforce and making sure that we're getting the right skills in that workforce. So we very much see ourselves as a sort of global leader in enforcement, global corruption, investigations and prosecutions and will continue to go from strength to strength.
I'm interested to hear from you.
Yes, speaking as a private practice lawyer who would like to see more enforcement to pay the bills, etc. The general consensus has been that there has been a slight drop over the last 10 years or so in the amount of bribery and corruption investigations that you see being pursued, not just in the UK but globally. But instead we're seeing a real uptick in other types of work. Speaking principally of sanctions, where of course sanctions have featured hugely, obviously in the last 3 years, but because of that experience, I've also been particularly interested in the policy thinking, the policy discussion that has accompanied that trend. I'm slightly alarmed, and I want to try to articulate what exactly alarms me and where I think we all should be alarmed and focusing so that the policy doesn't take us in a very unfortunate direction. What is particularly alarming is the schizophrenic mismatch between the importance of sanctions. It's the last resort, it's the only thing we have short of military intervention. Yet the fragility of sanctions is a legal instrument. The legal actions are really quite shaky. And when you then add to that the rhetoric of we must all comply, these are fantastically serious offences, yet zero enforcement. Where does that take us? And do we need to think carefully about how we might address that obvious mismatch? But most importantly, and this is where hopefully it all ties together, the temptation to reach those actions as a response to criminal activity is overwhelming because sanctions are so powerful. They are far more powerful as an asset freeze than any criminal law measure, than any civil asset freeze. And that's because of that dual function. They not only freeze what's in the bank, but they also erect the shield so you can't increase or transfer to any benefit. And that ultimately means that once something is sanctioned, it is, in the words of one of the EU courts advocate generals, a financial death sentence. But of course, individuals are all the more so used to corporate assets. They will eventually, sooner rather than later, completely die. So as a measure of as a tool that's enormously powerful, and should we really be deploying it in a criminal justice context? Now, obviously that ship has sailed, and it's very much sailed in the corruption context because we've seen it so powerfully and so globally being rolled out by some time ago, decades ago, and really picked up here post-Brexit, particularly with the Magnitsky sanctions push. So Magnitsky in the US, for example, combines human rights and corruption sanctions under one roof, but really corruption sanctions and human rights sanctions, but really even that break between natural almost moving as well, because we're seeing more and more country-specific sanctions regimes introduce designation criteria that are triggered by activity, not least circumvention activity. And the real problem is obvious because there is no investigation, there is no prosecution, yet you end up on a list for everyone to see, for everyone to act on, based on an allegation of criminal activity, which is at best quite shaky evidentially, but at worst, not even due to your own conduct, because a lot of the sanctions designation criteria are based on association or benefit provided, benefit received. So it can touch all sorts of and I realise I'm banging on a bit, so I'm going to try to tie it up and say that the lack of enforcement is probably a good one when you look at it from the perspective of how easily sanctions are imposed, but the downside is that you fail to really capture what's going on in reality, not just because of that awesome effect that it has in the immediate context of an asset case, but also on the policy level. We hear a lot about keeping dirty money out of the UK and making sure that bad actors can't come in. But where are they going to go if they're not coming in? And is that the better approach of dealing with corruption in the grand scheme of things? And the second point is that if it's locked in under sanctions as a case, sanctions have criminogenic effects. You're equating city cuts for all sorts of interesting behavior and the temptation to not just defeat sanctions, not just to defeat frozen assets by legitimate means, paying professional fees, potentially, but also to transfer them out in various wonderful ways is also overwhelming. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really good. Shani, I'm really interested in an industry perspective as well. We've heard from law enforcement, we've heard from the legal sector. I'm interested in what's happening on the ground in financial services.
Yes, so a straightforward answer to your question, even though the FCPA potentially is involved in this enforcement together with the UK position is changing, from a banking position is that change is neither going to change momentum nor is going to change their focus. And I think it's important when we answer this question, split it into two. And on the first half of my answer, I'm going to use what I think is a foreign analogy with banks like super companies. It takes a long time to get going. Once we get going, we're not exactly easy to shoot and stop. So the reality is we've got the competency framework and banks spin up teams that policy, supervision, there's training, there's SMOs, there's infrastructure, there's IT. So realistically, when there's a change in focus in enforcement, whether it's going up or down, that doesn't disturb that bit of work. It will just keep on. That's the first part of it. Where ABC enforcement comes in is if you get to the second half of the answer, and that is you identify you have got an ABC issue and it has crystallised. And it's at that stage you have to start to advise on downstream consequences. What is your exposure either to the US or the UK or the EU? How do you manage it? How do you close it? Now, thankfully, I spend my life on the first half of the equation to ensure that the book of work carries on and it works. If I ever find myself in the second half of that equation, which is going to be a rarity, the reality is, we've probably heard this in the first panel, I'm going to be reaching for the external I'll be reaching for the consultant. So therefore, looping it back to the start, it is just very much, we see geopolitics changing, but from a bank's perspective, just keep calm and carry on.
I think that's a really important message. I want to come back to Emma, if that's okay. So we've already touched a little bit on the FCA and whether the messages that we are getting from government are potentially causing some confusion or some inertia on the side of the FCA. I'm really interested in any type of advice or guidance that you could give us on how firms should know what to focus on and where to prioritize, especially when they're getting mixed messages from different parts of the world.
I think it's really important not to react in the moment. there's a lot of uncertainty, particularly about overseas partners and particularly around the FCPA. I think it's also I can't give advice because I'm from a government organisation, but my view is that it would be good to remember that the FCPA and in fact the UK Bribery Act have a very wide global reach, and that investigations can take some time on both sides, and so there is unlikely to be a change in the pattern of enforcement, so investigation, prosecution, for the time being at least, and obviously we're seeing the introduction of new powers under ECTA in September of this year, including failure to prevent fraud, which obviously we're all gearing up for on both sides, where we have the reasonable measures test. And some of you may have seen that we recently charged a corporate under Section 7 of the Bribery Act for failing to have adequate measures to prevent bribery, UIBL case. And that's listed for trial in 2027, and that, if it goes to trial will be the first contested Section 7 offence that we've seen. So that would be instrumental and very extremely informative, obviously, for all of us in seeing how that pans out. I think very much echoing my fellow panellists' message, keep calm and carry on. We all have BAU to contend with. We all have sort of international dimensions to our work. So I think just keeping that awareness that agencies are still receiving referrals, they're still receiving whistleblower accounts. We have to act on those. We're very keen on pushing the whistleblower incentivisation, as you may have seen from some of our speeches. And we hope to see that in place in the next few years, where whistleblowers are recompensed for the outcome of any conviction. And that will be a judge-led process. We're very keen for that to be a court pre-trial decision by any agency, particularly us. So we think all of these measures, including those steps that we're taking that I outlined earlier, mean that corporates should be alive as ever, and advisors and enablers to the landscape, the regulatory and enforcement landscape out there, including new legislation.
I know we've talked about ABC sanctions already. I think we've touched on that. I think one of the things that's on my mind when it comes to any kind of sanctions, but especially to the ABC sanctions, is are they actually fair and effective when it comes to being an anti-corruption tool? And the other thing that really interests me is what legal safeguards, if any, should there be in place when it comes to these ABC sanctions?
I think there are two answers. Obviously, I'm not a politician or a policy maker, so I should perhaps leave that to others. But what I see in practice, and one of the more interesting effects that sanctions has had on practice, is just how the new obligations are landing, and I'm thinking in particular of reporting obligations. We're used to dealing with anti-money laundering reporting obligations and terrorism financing reporting obligations, but the sanctions obligations obligations that have been introduced under the sanctions regimes go far beyond that and are really quite tricky to navigate. We don't have the same record or tipping off or prejudice in an investigation. And that creates a real vulnerability, particularly when you couple that with the ownership and control test, which, as you may know, is a complete nightmare. And if you are firing off reports that effectively call someone out as owned and controlled in circumstances where that report is very much disposable and affected parties take issue with your particular assessment, then you are, I'm afraid, a little bit exposed. And again, that's compounded by the fact that there is a real obvious lack of enforcement, which means that there's perhaps more appetite for people to pursue defamation claims or other types of interesting responses, private responses to what they see as over-reliance or mistaken compliance.
Sorry, Mayor, can I just comment on that? Because of course you've got pros and cons around whether you do this and whether you don't. And let's park that to one side. What I'm more concerned about is, I think we can all agree, those who are not meant to be the subject of those sanctions don't suffer the effects of them. And so what I'm particularly interested in is whenever we designate, we please ensure we do any identifiers from the person. Because ultimately what we want to be able to do is identify true match and discount false match. Because there are individuals, and if you look at sanctions list, the fewer identifiers there are, those accounts are going to be held until we become comfortable that's not the person that's subject to sanction. And that person is a totally innocent person who can't do their shopping. So what I would say is, whether we do go down the route of using corruption and sanctions together, that's a conversation we had. But if we choose to use that, we'll make it as clear and as concise, as simple as possible, so operators such as myself can actually target the right individuals and not inconvenience genuine innocent people.
I love the topic of innocence because it's really interesting for me. We usually see people when they're from other countries. Right? There is nobody around from the own domestic country. Right? The interesting part in all of this is also that the FCPA is just all about foreign rather than anything domestic. In the UK, I think we've got maybe some similar issues around this. I don't want to talk about just sanctions. I'm really interested in ABC programs. When I did my PhD, I did research on corruption perception in financial services. And I did some interviews there. And one of the people that I interviewed said something really interesting to me. They said, most financial services firms don't really know what to do with ABC. Because there is not a lot of ABC enforcement that would bring ABC to the forefront of people's minds and make them really look at it. And the other problem I think that we have is that we probably still haven't got an aim right. So how can we move into ABC? But what should a good ABC compliance program really look like?
I am looking at you. No, I think it's really difficult, and I think the lawyer's answer of it depends is very apt here, because it really does depend on the size of the organisation, the industry in which they operate, who's looking at what where, and as a lawyer, you don't have a compliance manual that you roll out for all your clients. You have all sorts of versions like of different types and different strategies that you've used over the years, which have been more successful than others. But there's also that perennial debate about whether you have a compliance manual that specifically deals with corruption and on 5 on sanctions, or if you combine them all on intricate causing policy. It really depends, because I can't say that I've ever advised a client twice, if you see what I mean, given the same advice to different clients on this particular client. It's really case specific, which is the most unhelpful answer ever, but where we are definitely having to spend a lot of time really referring to myself as the referral information, because they have lots of practical problems that are not immediately easy to solve.
For me, this is really not it's not a difficult answer. I think the answer that you give to me really shows that when we think about corruption, we mostly think about bribery. But I think that's really not what it should be. Because bribery is really about, the exchange of favors or money. Whereas corruption really is something a little bit different, right? I think in corruption it's more about me rather than you. Corruption is all about how can I succeed, how can I be better, how can I be at the top of the game, and how can I be better than everybody else around them. But leaving that to the side, I'm interested what keeps you up at night. And I want to go to Charlene there first. When it comes to ABC, what keeps you up at night?
I'll answer that question. Let me just answer the question just before it about what is a good ABC program. Within a banking context, for those who are banking we have bank-wide risk assessments, we have enterprise-wide risk assessments. And that will spin out the inherent risk, the control, and the resilience. So the simple answer to the question is, what's a good ABC program? It's one that has an effective control, which brings a residual risk. And you make the two work in a symbiotic. And the reason, and picking up Anna's point, the reason why I can genuinely say it depends on the institution. If you are a UK-based entity with no overseas footprint, and you focus on the UK market, your exposure, your inherent exposure to bribery and corruption is manifestly different than if you're a global bank doing infrastructure projects across the world. And so your controls and sophistication of those controls will be different. But in any case, there will be that relationship with the BWRA or EWRA. That's the case. That's now, in answer to that question that you've just asked, what keeps me up at night? And I'm no different to anybody else. Right? We have portfolios of work, we've got different types of financial crime things, and it's when you talk about enforcement, this is where the answer starts. Right now, I turn on the news, I'm watching geopolitics in the Middle East. I'm also watching the Russian-Ukraine conflict. We've had reference to the fraud bill. I've also seen we've got the fraud prevent stuff coming through, and now we've got ABC. So I've got finite resource and finite time with one core system, and I'm only talking about financial crime. I'm working in a bank. I mean, we've got consumer duty, we've got vulnerable persons, we've got credit liquidity issues as well that you've got to manage. So as a bank, you have to not only prioritise your financial crime portfolio, you have to manage your financial crime portfolio across your credit portfolio. So what keeps me up at night is, have we got the priority right? Are we correctly reflecting, I think there was a question asked earlier, have we correctly documented that the priority decision we're taking is sufficiently robust? And as things change, have we reflected those changes and determined whether we should change our priority or not? And my greatest fear is everyone's, just because the world is better with hindsight, it doesn't mean it's stupid before. But go back to the first panel, when a regulator comes in and says, but why did you make that decision at that time? I need to be comfortable I've got it right, even if in the end it turned out to be wrong. And that's what keeps me up at night. Can I justify the decision I've made in the eyes of the regulator?
Very much the same. Margaret Hodge keeps me up at night because of professional enabling rhetoric, which has really been dominant the last 3 years, but it does tie in very neatly with the corruption topic, because of course it comes back to this question about culture and organisations, and is it the culture that we ought to be focusing on, and that then raises the question of what then is the culture that makes you a professional enabler? Is it a profession-wide culture, as sometimes the regulators may suggest? And as a sort of side note, I was sent to my horror a research study by a university I won't name, but they were on an FCDO-funded study looking at the question of whether lawyers flagged for sanctions for individuals or other individuals who were accused of bad behaviour had their moral compasses twisted, and eventually, therefore, prioritise the client's interests above the public interest. And that is a real hot topic in the regulatory sphere as well. Lawyers are not prioritised the public interest enough, and that's why we have slaps, that's why we have other undesired behaviour. But the real problem with that line of thought is, what is the public interest? Who gets to define it? And do we all agree on the definition? And that's where I think we're dangerously veering, like, not really down bad alley, but the particular immediate problem for professional enablers is that if you are hampered in your ability to represent people, or hampered in your ability to bring particular types of claims, that's not obviously desirable development for the rule of law either. So the types of innovations that we see in sanctions and also in other areas of law as an immediate response to a particular problem, often an enforcement problem. How do we get corporates prosecuted better? How do we get better intelligence to bring better investigations? Sometimes the tools that we use in the innovation that we introduce are longer term consequences. That's quite a lot that we do. Particularly
I hope it wasn't time, and I think Northern countries should definitely not keep up. I think there's something that you need to worry about. I'm interested about what keeps the best informed.
Thanks. Not necessarily what does that look like just yet, but just to refer to one of the comments that Michael Hodge made earlier on about enforcement agencies having a poor record when it comes to lobbying corruption. That may have been sometime in the past, and it's part of our history, but we're very much looking forward and very excited about our bonding and our powers coming soon, and everything that I've already spoken about. We, in relation to the comment on unexplained wealth orders as well, we actually use that power. It's a very important tool as part of civil recovery, so it's part of our civil recovery division who are very powerful in what they do. Small but mighty, that's just great things. We, in terms of just going back to the compliance discussion, from our perspective, we've issued our corporate guidance, and but would very much urge you to have a read because it's much more detailed than our expectations in terms of when a corporate is deciding to self-report or not to the SFO. And it may be an early conversation that's required, and we're very much encouraging that. So I think with our new tools and techniques and our increased intel capabilities, our embracing of artificial intelligence, our new cryptocurrency investigation team who are looking at sort of blockchain analysis and forensic investigation of cryptocurrency, I would turn that around and say, of course, I hope that the Serious Fraud Office is keeping you all up at night and on your toes. but you know, in the tone of our corporate guidance, we very much want to speak to corporates when they discover issues and work together. And I echo the comments from the previous panel about having a plan before you come and speak to us, but not necessarily leaving it too long.
We have some time for questions. If anybody has any questions for, yes, over there, please.
Just regarding the SFO, do you feel that having dual role as both regulator and prosecutor causes problems for you, in that people may not wish to engage with you if they have identified regulatory problems for fear of prosecution? And is that perhaps the case that you either go down the route of regulation or of prosecution, but not both?
Thank you. We're not actually a regulator, we're an investigator and prosecution agency. Our corporate guidance is intended for corporates who are investigating potential criminal wrongdoing and would like to self-report with a view to the SFO investigating and potentially making either prosecuting or entering into negotiations about the deferred prosecution agreement. That said, we do work very closely with the regulators, particularly the FCA, on some of our shared interests, and we regularly receive referrals from regulators. And likewise, we pass, if we receive referrals from members of the public or whistleblowers that have a regulatory theme that aren't suitable for us, we'll refer them out to those agencies as well.
Thanks very much for the thought-provoking panel. And apologies again. There were media reports about Isabel promising to push for growth, and I just wondered if you could elaborate on what exactly is the reason behind this.
Thank you. We're not actually pushing for growth ourselves. That's not our job. But it's always been a key part of our mission that we want to make UK PLC a safe place to do business, and we do that by enforcing the Bribery Act and other legislation. So we continue to enforce, to investigate and prosecute as we have done until now, using our new powers and our new resources. So it's very much aligned with the current government's focus on growth, if you like, but it's always been one of our key parts of our mission prior to the new government strategy.
Anything else on that? I think if we have nothing else, I think we'll have coffee. Thank you so much,
Okay, guys, it's coffee break. Let me see if I can to speak to one or two people and ask them some questions that I think are quite relatable to some of my subscribers in Africa. I think Emma will be a good person because she works at the serious fraud office. So let me see if I can go speak to her. Hi guys, just take a short break. I'll join the live again in about 30 minutes. Just want to take a quick break and charge and recharge again.